official title of my presentation is Dealing with Traffic Impacts and Traffic Issues at Charter Schools. Obviously, it's easier to fit this on the screen. But what I'm talking about today is based on some data we've collected in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. And in the matter of dealing with it, not only after it's in the ground, but also before in the planning stages of what to prepare for, what you can expect, what we've seen of charter schools that have gone in operation in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. So part of it is that you have, this is what, charter schools coming in, they said, this is what traffic's going to look like before. We're not going to have any impact to the area roadways. Then it's built, and it's a little bit different picture. Similarly, part of the issue with schools in general, just not charter schools, is at the end of the day when parents pick up their kids, they tend to get there a little bit early, some earlier than others. And so you kind of worry about queuing, not just on site, but primarily off of site, blocking public roadways. So in the same sense, this may be what they say the queuing is going to look like, and then what happens is something entirely different. So when we're looking at charter schools, just a brief background is charter school and a public school, kind of what's the difference. This is just a summary. I'm not going to go word by word, and I don't expect you to read it. But charter schools and public schools are very similar. They're free. They're open to anybody. There's a lottery system, which is different than elementary school, but there's no special requirements for getting in. Some of the differences and kind of the focus of the study is that for a charter school, there's typically very little busing provided. Elementary school, you may have 10, 12, 15 buses that come and pick up the kids and take them on. That's 50 students right there in one vehicle. For a charter school, typically there are not school buses of that size. The other thing is the attendance zone. You can see here, this is just a sample attendance zone for a school up in the Dallas area. Real compact, real nice and neat. There's no such attendance zone per se for a charter school. They're able to pull from not just multiple school districts, but also across multiple counties. Granted, it must be a good charter school if you're going across 2 counties to get to it, but they still have that option of pulling from a wide, larger area. The other thing is the footprint of the school. The charter schools that have come in tend to have a smaller footprint than a public school. They tend to be typically building and parking lot, whereas the elementary school is a lot larger. They may have the same size building and parking lot, but they have playgrounds, a lot more green space. So from a U.S. perspective, charter schools started in 1992. There's about 6,043 states. In Texas, it started in 95, and then in 97, there were about 25,000 students. 20 years later, there are about 247,000 students, with many on a waiting list, and 13% growth in the last 10 years. So you can see that this is a high-demand product. I'm not here to say whether it's good or bad. I'm just here to look about traffic. So obviously, it's in demand. And just for your viewing pleasure, if you can find where you're from, you can find a charter school. That's where they are. In the Dallas-Fort Worth area, which is what I'm focusing on, this is just the growth in the DFW area over time. This is from a Dallas Morning News article. And back in 2014, there were over 100. My guess is that's probably closer to 125, 150 at this time. So what I'm going to look at here is kind of 3 facets of charter school: trip generation, peak hour factor, and the queuing associated with it. So from a trip generation perspective, you don't have buses. So like I said, that's 50 kids in one bus that you actually have to get to school somehow. And typically with elementary school, you have a lot more pedestrians because it's a more concentrated area. That's not necessarily the case with charter school and a larger attendance boundary. So for this study, this is from a previous study we had done. We had 8 sites. 5 of them were charter schools and 3 of them were private schools in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. And so they were, the trip generation characteristics of these 2 were very similar. As you can see here, during the AM peak, with the charter and private schools, it's about 1.14 trips per student. And you can see from a charter and private school perspective, charter's a little bit higher from a rate perspective than a private school. And you can see the ranges that we had in the study, in the sites we collected. In the PM period, it's kind of the same thing. Charter's a little bit higher than the private school. Average is right between the two of them. So we have these numbers for a charter school. We have these numbers for a private school. So we kind of say, how does this compare with what the trip generation manual says? You know, the Bible of trip generation of many studies across the country. So we compared this to the IT trip generation. Just looked at elementary school real quick, private school, and then land use code 537, charter elementary school. So you can see by this the difference between just a private school and elementary school. A private school has approximately twice as many trips as a public elementary school does. I don't think this is a surprise. Like I said, private schools typically do not have buses as well. So then we throw in our DFW data in compared to a private school. And you can see that the charter school is about 30% higher in the morning and about 15% higher than a private school in the PM. And part of the reason why that's important is because in the 9th edition of the Trip Generation Manual, there was no charter school land use. There was a public elementary school and a private school K through 8. So given the choice, I know when we first started working on charter schools, we used a private school because that was the best data that was available. But as you can see, that may not have necessarily been the case, but that was the best data we had at that time. A couple weeks ago, September 22nd, the 10th edition of the Trip Generation Manual came out. And they actually have land use 937, which is a charter elementary school. And these are the results. You can see that the trip generation rates are closer to what we've collected, that they are higher than the private schools were in the 9th edition. You may notice here that the 10th edition has 6 data points, 6 studies that were used, and that in our studies there were 5 studies that were used. We submitted our data to ITE for inclusion in the 10th edition. However, there was a misunderstanding, and the 5 studies we input did not get input into this data set. So there's no duplication of data. Unfortunately, the ITE data should be higher, should approach our numbers, since our numbers are higher than that, at least in the AM. And in the PMP, you can kind of see that our numbers, the numbers we collect in the DFW, are a little bit lower than what is in the new 10th edition. So we've got these differences in numbers, and just looking at the 9th edition, since the 10th edition is still rather new on the street, you can kind of see the difference in the trips generated, looking at it from a K through 8, a private school standpoint with the DFW data. This is assuming a hypothetical school population of 800 students. And you can see that you have a considerable number more of trips generated with using the DFW data, kind of getting back to that first picture of no traffic with traffic all over the place. And then you also have more in the PM. Now when you look at the 10th edition, you have, we had over 200 difference in the 9th edition, and with the improvements in the new 537 land use, that difference has been reduced, and actually in the PM we're actually underneath that number. So the 10th edition is obviously an improvement if you don't have locally collected data available. And hopefully once they incorporate the data we've submitted, it will help narrow this gap even more. The other thing to look at is the peak hour factor. I'm assuming everybody in here knows or is aware of the peak hour factor, which just basically accounts for the variation of flow throughout the hour. The closer it is to 1, the more normalized the traffic is. The lower the peak hour factor, the larger the variation in a 15-minute period. And the peak hour factor of 0.92 is typically your default normal value. So if you look at compared to the data we collected, you can see that the entering and the exiting peak hour factors are significantly lower than the 0.92 that is the default. And this obviously can play an impact on when you are looking at planning for a site or doing a traffic study, and impacts of how much traffic or what the traffic will exactly be. So combining those two things, combining the higher trip generation and the lower peak hour factor, we'll go back to this slide right here. This is one I showed earlier, just with the 100 trips difference in the AM and fewer trips using the DFW data, DFW charter school data compared to the 10th edition. Now, if you throw the peak hour factor in and apply the peak hour factor to those numbers, you can see here that the impact of a school with 800 students is significantly increased by applying that peak hour factor. And for purpose of this case, I just used the peak hour factor of 0.6. That's kind of what we've used on recent charter school studies to kind of take into account, the last 5, 10, 15 minutes before they show up late sometimes. And then also, the rush leaving, not just in the morning, but you get 500 kids in the cars and you leave all at once. So that kind of takes into account. You can kind of see the difference in what you may think is going to happen, but then when you apply the actual trip generation, real data, trip generation, and the peak hour factor, you kind of get a different number. A real-time example of this is real data that was collected, and I had used IT trip generation and a peak hour factor of 0.92 just for the associated school movements, and then compared it to the DFW data we collected along with the 0.6 peak hour factor. You can kind of see the delay values are significantly higher, which is not a surprise, but you can kind of see the difference in why after some schools open and they may not have looked at it as accurately as possible. The final thing I'm going to look at is the queuing of the school. This is typically during the school release times. Start of the school day is not as critical because you get there, you drop them off, you leave. So it's pretty straightforward. Most of the queuing issues occur during the school dismissal when parents sometimes tend to show up early, and then it takes a while for the kids to come to the car, to find the car, to walk to the car, to get into the car, and then to leave. So there's a lot more time involved in doing that. Some of the factors involved in queuing operations is that, like I mentioned before, arriving early. We've had some schools we've observed where 45 minutes before school starts, the parking lot is already full. Sometimes it's nice and they wait till an hour to fill it. They wait an hour before it fills up. So that's one of the issues that we have seen. The number of dismissals plays a factor. If you dismiss 800 students all at once, you can imagine that's a little bit different than dismissing 400 students at once and then 400 students a certain time later. The time between the dismissals is important. Obviously, if you dismiss 800 students, 400 students at one point, 400 students an hour later, that's nice. But if you go 15 minutes, then there's some overlap in the release times. Similarly, the number of students in the dismissal, if you have 50 students in one dismissal, 750 in the other, it's not going to go well. The other thing is the grades in the dismissal. The younger kids, kindergartners, first graders, second graders, they don't walk as fast as the older kids. The older kids are maybe more excited to get home and away from school. And the younger kids don't know which red car is theirs. So they just see a red car, and so it takes them a little bit longer to get there. Other things are the number of pickup locations. Kind of makes sense. If you only have one pickup location, everybody's going to one place. If you have 2 or 3 locations, you're able to disperse traffic around the site accordingly. Getting back to the small kids, older kids, obviously if it's a long distance, it takes them longer to walk. The amount of staff assisting and present on site to help move students along, move parents along sometimes, as they tend to sometimes have a social hour at the school dismissal times in the pickup queue line. And also the pickup technology that's used. Most of the charter schools we've worked with, they just don't say, okay, it's 3 o'clock, everybody leave. There's some technology that's used. I get that next slide. And the other thing that's most important is obviously the amount of on-site queuing available. If you only have 500 feet of on-site queuing available, you need 600 or you need 1,500. It's not going to work. You can't fit 600 feet of queuing into 500 feet of queuing. So that's kind of the obvious, one of the obvious factors. Real quick aside, just some of this pickup technologies we've seen. Just simple text messaging with kids with a certain number or input their names. Use Google Hangouts, a barcode symbol. Some have just scan the barcode on a piece of paper in the window. Old-fashioned walkie-talkies. And then there's a software that's called driveline queuing, which is similar to the text messaging, except you push the number in, and then it's connected to each classroom, and it says, it says 1, 2, 3, and that means Johnny Simpson needs to come out, and so he'll come out, and hopefully by the time he comes out, the car is already waiting for him in the queue line. Of the sites we studied, this is a result of the queuing that we witnessed. Everything in blue are the result of the private schools. I've included those in here just because I thought it was interesting that other private schools tended to have a lower queuing rate based on the feet we observed per student than the charter school. I'm not sure why, but that's just what the results showed. So you can kind of see the breakdown by the number of students, the number of dismissals, and then the other factors I identified earlier, pickup locations and the time between the dismissals. For one of these, this is actually the queuing operation sample. I think this one had 3 different dismissal periods, which should be fairly obvious in the 3 peaks of the vehicles queued on site. This was a low enrollment school, as you can see, with only 27 cars queued at its peak max, but you can definitely see the differences in the queues, and I believe there's about 30-minute difference in the release time, so you can kind of see how it actually dissipates. Whereas if you push them in 15-minute, then that doesn't dissipate as much, and it kind of helps build. So I'll show just some graphical relationships here. Everything in red on the next few slides are charter schools. Everything in blue is private schools, and that's just kind of for informational purposes. But from an enrollment perspective, the more students you have doesn't really indicate that the queue rate was any different. The main thing I see here is that the queue rate appeared to be less for a private school than for a charter school. And I also have the number of dismissals here, and you kind of see for the charter schools with 1 dismissals, they're all kind of clustered up near the middle with 5 feet per student. Looking at the number of pickup locations, which is another factor we looked at, you can kind of see that you had one with 1 pickup location and 1 dismissal. They are all about the 5 feet per student. The charter schools were all about the same. So the number of pickup locations with the number of dismissals. The next one that I thought was more important, kind of what I've found, is that the number of dismissals has appeared to be kind of a better indicator of the queue rate. I didn't do any statistical analysis of if this is statistically significant for this one or the others, but just looking at it, you can, like I said, you can see that the ones with 1 dismissal are all grouped around 5 feet per student. As you get to the 15 and 30-minute, 20-minute, looking at the private schools as well, you kind of get a lower queue rate. And based on this data, what we have seen is that we typically assume a queue rate, if knowing nothing about the school, we typically assume about 4.4 feet per student, just based on the data that we've come up with. One of the other things I like to talk about is that the North Carolina DOT has a division within their department that focuses on school traffic studies, data, information. I don't expect you to read this graph, but this is just a representation of a spreadsheet they've developed that allows you to put the data in, and it magically runs through the algorithms and produces a result of what the anticipated queue is for a school. We have used this sometimes just as a confirmation of the numbers we've come up with. At 4.4 students, kind of what we have used. For 800 students, this spreadsheet actually identifies about a 4.2 foot per student. And so this is based on a lot more data than what we have. We have 5 charter schools, and I don't know what their number is, but it's significantly higher than 5. As a side note, this also can be used for public schools. There's a tab for public schools, and there's also a tab for private or non-urban charter schools. So that's a long website, but if you type in NCDOT and then MSTA in Google, it will take you here, and then you can download this spreadsheet, which is free. They do update it occasionally, so you may need to look at and see if they have the latest update, which is 10/28/16 right now. So as a basis for dealing with the impacts, from a planning standpoint, what we found at least is that the DFW data is higher than the trip generation data, ITE trip generation data. More so in the ninth edition than the recent 10th edition. Like I said, in the PM, we're a little bit less, 0.69 rather than 0.72 that the 10th edition has. The other thing is use of a non-default peak hour factor as part of doing the analysis to kind of get a more accurate representation of what the school may look like after it's in operation. And then the final thing is just that the queuing is dependent on operational factors, that it's site-by-site basis. It's kind of hard to apply a 4.4 feet per student, but it's an idea. It gives you an idea of what may happen. Site-by-site, it depends on how active the staff is, how willing the staff is to be out there every day, sometimes in the rain, most of the times in the heat. Also, amount of queuing available inside, as I said, and just the dismissal characteristics. But like I said, for our studies, we typically use 4.4 just based on the data that we have, and then use that in the NCDOT just kind of as a confirmation. So that's all that I have at this time, but open to questions.
Any questions? The question is so many feet per student. So if there are 5 students entering one car, you're going to divide 8 by 5.
Yeah, thanks for asking the question. I need to clarify that a little bit. What we had done is that we knew the number of students that were in attendance that day, and we identified the number of cars that were queued, and so the number of maximum cars that were queued. And so that gave us the maximum queue length that we observed. Yeah.
From an owner's perspective, a private school owner, or the people who are running the school, how much they should be worried about the lenient standards that many cities have on requiring them to store the queue within their premise. What happens is queues spill over onto the street network and causes a lot of issues.
Mm-hmm.
So some thoughts on that. Do the city, or should the city require some kind of circulation plan with their DIA before approval, or some sort of your thought process on that?
His question is with the TIA, which is traffic impact analysis, that a lot of cities approve having it outside, no circulation in the schools. Should the cities require the circulation to be inside the school before it comes out because of the traffic congestion that it gives on the streets?
Yeah.
Okay.
Most of the cities we've worked with in Dallas-Fort Worth, they've actually started developing policies as part of school traffic studies to look at a circulation plan. And as part of that circulation plan, they require the operator to agree that if any queuing occurs out into public right-of-way, then they are required to remedy that situation. And one of the studies we did in one of the cities up there, they made some major modifications. They added about 1,800, 2,000 feet of queuing on site to accommodate the city's request. So,
Two more questions. Yes, sir. The question is, was there any consideration for students who had after-school programs?
We did not look at whether the presence of after-school activities. We knew that there were some that were, some of the schools had some. I know a couple of schools, it wasn't very heavy. This is, the middle schools, obviously there's volleyball and basketball, but we didn't look at that specifically.
The question is if consideration was for the breakfast and the lunch goers, and if people came early and it skewed the data, which you got.
Yeah, well, the data we collected, we tried to collect an hour before school started, before the official school time. And so we're focusing on the AM peak hour of the school. So if the breakfast, we may have collected the data, but breakfast may have been outside that peak hour. So, but we weren't aware which schools had a breakfast program and which schools didn't.